Eddie Rester here. The Boundary series we've been doing in the month of January has touched a nerve with a lot of folks. We've talked about what it means to set boundaries, the vocabulary of boundaries, how that plays out in our families, and how that plays out in our work. And what we've discovered is that as we've had these conversations, more questions have arisen. So what we're going to do today is just take some of the questions that you've asked. In fact, some of our young adults have really peppered us with a lot of questions about boundaries. And what we want to do, I'm here with Sarah Beth Walker and Jay Nelson. We're just going to have a conversation from some of the questions that you've offered. So Jay, what's the first question you got for us?
Yeah, so many that we won't possibly get to them. But Sarah Beth, I'd love to start with this one. It came right off the bat from our young adults, and this is what they asked. It said, how do you implement a boundary in a relationship that already exists? Maybe they hadn't gotten there yet, right? This is a relationship that's already there, and they're like, oh, but I hadn't really talked about boundaries. We haven't really established this. So they're wanting to take that first step. Where do they go?
I think I would start off by just having, I think honesty and transparency and just a realness of the needs that you have, thinking about you and that other person in a relationship that you have. It might be you need more time with them. It might mean you need them to help you in a different way or step back in relationship because it's messing with like y'all's closeness. And so, yeah, I think the first part would be just the honesty and transparency. Yeah.
As I think about that question, honesty, transparency, that's part of it, but it's also acknowledging that sometimes relationships shift. Sometimes as a kid grows up, the relationship with their parents as they graduate from college, that relationship shifts and it becomes a different thing than it was before. And so figuring out how do I relate to a parent or how do I relate to a child now in this moment is different. I've got a daughter who's about to graduate from college. And so we can already feel that relationship is shifting and there's going to be a resetting of boundaries in that relationship simply because we're going to be at different stages in life. Every time my wife has taken on a new job with different hours, different responsibilities, it's impacted our relationship as well. We've had to kind of figure out where the boundaries are for conversations and what's allowable, what's okay, what's not okay.
Yeah. So let's try to put that on the ground floor of when maybe there's a friend, right? And you guys have just existed in the same place for a long time. And maybe they've stretched and just grown into a different type of person. Maybe it's you, maybe it's both of you. Let's take that idea, right, of creating a boundary. What's a great question to begin with that person, right? I get honesty, transparency. When you go, hey, we got to talk, where they actually can receive it. And you say, hey, I really need to ask you this, or I really want us to dive into this. And I know that could go a lot of different ways, but just maybe some really helpful questions when somebody goes, yeah, I get it, honesty and transparency, but how do I actually get there? That first question. What do you think?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind would actually be instead of going to the why, kind of trying to get rid of the why question of why are you doing this, or kind of the what or why, it can be a kind of offendable in a way. I love to use the wordage of help me understand where you're at. And so that might mean you go get coffee or whatever, and there's a curiosity that is great to have in a friendship where if I come at somebody with curiosity, then I can understand their world in a better way. That way we can both see where each other are at, and we can meet each other, hopefully, where each person can be heard and understood.
I think curiosity, that's a great word because people aren't put off by curiosity. If I went at someone and said, well, why are you doing this now? They're going to get very defensive. But if I can say, help me understand why you get angry about this, it changes the tone of the conversation. And sometimes resetting boundaries or resetting a relationship it's helped when we have the right tone in a conversation.
Yeah, actually, I learned this in school. It was 93% of communication is nonverbal. And so keeping that in mind when you're talking to someone about boundaries and where you both need to go is giving them eye contact, leaning towards them, nodding to them. Those types of things really helps them to know that you're there trying to work with them.
So you're saying I can't just text somebody about such things? I can't just go ahead and just
You
shoot
can.
through a message?
Yeah.
You can. It's a way to do it.
I will oftentimes in my office, I'll look at some of my teenagers and say, okay, so tell me if you think I'm listening to you. Hey, I'm listening to you and I'm on my phone and I'm hearing you and yeah, what do you want to say? And they'll be like, yeah, you're not listening to me. So that's an example that I give.
Yeah.
I always wondered where they got that number from, right? That's 93%, 85%, whatever it may be. But I think it's safe to say and really fair to say that everybody comes in on the high end of that number, which I think leads us to a really great segue into a second question that could be really tricky. And so, and so it kind of revolves more around this, right? Still the idea of boundaries. How do we implement those boundaries? But does every boundary have to have a conversation? Because there's only 24 hours in a day. And so does everything need it? And as though you could craft it for us, where's that line where you can go, these do, and these just don't?
I think for me, as I think about some of the boundaries I've had to say, I think there's sometimes in relationships where you owe it to the other person to have a conversation. But sometimes it's as simple as saying, I don't think we need to talk about that anymore. Sometimes it's, I think you mentioned earlier, in toxic relationships, we don't owe them that kind of explanation, or we don't owe them a conversation.
Right. For the safety of both people, you can be respectful to someone without actually you can draw your boundary without actually having the conversation with them. And sometimes that just means stepping back and protecting yourself. And that's actually still giving them respect and honor and care, even if you're not maybe talking to them as much or whatever it might be.
And one thing I always think is, somebody told me this years ago, you don't have to explain your boundary. You can simply say, I can't come to that event, or we can't make it for Thanksgiving, or I'm not comfortable with that. And you don't have to give a why. You don't have to help their feelings. You don't have to do any of that. You simply have to own what you're responsible for, what they're responsible for, what's okay and what's not okay.
I think you guys, there's a little nuance to that, though, that I'd love for us to just I want to make sure we're clear with everybody. Everyone, you guys were saying there's not necessarily a huge conversation that has to happen, but you both actually began to push into, but there do have to be some words that are said. That's totally, you didn't say, at least if I'm hearing you correctly, you didn't say just ghost someone or totally just ignore their text, ignore their phone calls. There might have to be something said. Am I hearing that right? Because that seems to be different than, well, my boundary is I don't have to have a conversation with you, so we're just not talking anymore. I'm
You
never
just put
returning.
the wall up and just say
done.
goodbye.
Be
Right,
done.
right.
Yeah.
And I think that's important, right? We talked about that in week one of a boundary, like a boundary is not a wall.
Correct.
And that's really important.
One of my friends talked about a boundary being more like a cell wall. It's permeable. And I've always liked that.
Like a medical cell.
Like
not like a
jail cell. Like,
Got it. Okay,
exactly.
got it, yeah.
A medical term, biological cell wall, and that it's permeable, but that wall also moves and grows and retreats at times.
Yeah.
Another example I like to use kind of along the same lines is I'll have somebody kind of come up with a visual of inside a fence, and they have this white fence around them, and all these people are standing outside the fence, and I'll ask, well, who do you want to come inside your fence, and do you want to open that door, and do you want to have that conversation, or do you want to build the fence higher, and like what would that look like, because maybe that's the safest place for both of you, kind of thing. So
And I love that you brought up safety, because I think sometimes there are relationships that are unsafe. And in those moments, I would say, I don't want to use the term ghost, but there are times when you just have to say, for now,
Yeah.
for now, we can't remain in contact. Would you say that that's true?
Yes, definitely. And I also mentioned earlier, I just have to say this, that I think we're in such a culture where we believe we have to make the other person happy and people please to just make everyone okay. And that's when you're inching into what we call codependency, which is, I don't really know where I end and you begin. And if I'm okay, like if you're okay, I'm okay. And like sometimes that other person might not be okay, and that's okay. You can be okay. And so you can say, I can't do that without every explanation under the book just to make sure the other person's okay.
Right. That's good. Wait, I want to end each one of our sessions with some things to get us from just what people were hearing from the pulpit down to the ground floor in their homes, in their work, with their families. And so, as you begin to think about just this whole concept of boundaries in general, we'll get more specific as we go along. But boundaries in general, what are a couple of questions that, if we're able to, the people that were kind enough to watch this, to go, these might be questions that it might be helpful to consider. Maybe one or two questions. I'd love to hear one or two, maybe from each of you, and then we'll see if that's helpful for our people.
I think I might would just start off, it sounds so simple, but asking yourself, what do I need? And what do I want in this relationship? Because the more self-reflective you can be and self-aware you can be is the beginning of knowing where your boundary is. Because I'll get caught up in myself a lot and I'm like, well, I need to draw this boundary, but half the time I won't even know what I really need first. So I think first asking that to yourself before you even go forward and setting the boundary.
It really is about this internal work within ourselves. And I think the question I might ask would be, what is it that's making me anxious, uncomfortable, unsafe at this moment in that relationship?
Yeah.
And doing the counterintuitive thing of actually leaning into that.
Right. Yeah.
Because then the further question beyond that, right, is there is a place to going, what do I need? But then there is that further question where, like, all right, and what's the Lord teaching me in this? Because if we don't just want to leave it at that, I know from all of it, we don't just want to leave it at that place of, this is what I need. We're like, that's not, the heart will deceive you.
Right.
But it is a thing. It has to be acknowledged so that you can figure out the right way to move forward.
I would also add into that, like, kind of along the emotional piece, like, I have found in my own life, where am I angry or what is coming up in me? I think is along the lines you're saying,
Yeah.
where I'm edgy with someone or I'm short-tempered. Like, maybe that's more about me and what's going on with me and where I'm choosing not to set a boundary.
Right.
So
That's good. Wait, thanks for being with us. There's going to be a lot more to come, and we're excited for you to tune in with these. Let us know. Let us know what you're thinking in the comments. We'd love to hear from you as well, and see what we can do as we go about setting good biblical boundaries for all of us, not just individually, but for the sake of our church as well.